Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share encounters with obscure cryptids and strange creatures, which includes a story that's a little bit different from what I normally do. These stories include an encounter with a strange beast in an orchard, one of the most bizarre stories I've done involving a humanoid encounter in Canada, a shadow creature in the Appalachian Mountains, and an imaginary friend that might be not so imaginary after all. But first, we start with a more familiar cryptid with stories that are hard to come by, and that is an encounter with the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Bowie, Maryland, where the original poster, or OP, had an encounter with what he believes to be the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. Bowie, according to the OP, is a suburb of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It was established in the late 1800s or early 1900s as a railroad town. Reports of the Goatman in and around the town date back to its establishment. The night of his encounter, the OP was hanging out with his friend in a spot they hung out in growing up, walking the railroad tracks and in the woods, usually going there to smoke and drink. There is a parking lot there with a strip of land separating it from the railroad tracks that is covered with grass and trees. It spans the 30 or so feet between the parking lot and the railroad tracks. The OP and his friend had gone out there to have a cigarette and were standing on the railroad tracks facing the parking lot. There is an overpass that goes over the tracks to their left, but the OP's attention was drawn to the right for reasons he cannot quite explain. He says he was overcome with the strangest feeling and didn't realize until later that it was the feeling of being watched. He says he has never felt it before and likens it to being watched by a predator. They were there for a few more minutes and were almost done with their cigarette when a helicopter flew overhead from the direction of the overpass, shining a spotlight that went right over the boys. The OP says not even 10 seconds later he heard the movement of gravel under the tracks and looked toward the overpass to see a massive silhouette standing there. The being, whatever it was concealed by the darkness created by the overpass, so the OP couldn't make out any of its features, but says it looked to be about 8 to 9 feet tall and extremely burly. He and his friend looked at this hulking being for a mere few seconds before deciding it was time to get out of there. They started running as they heard footsteps on the gravel behind them, with whatever this thing was moving closer. And then they heard, as the OP describes, the most demonic, horrifying, multiple-pitched screech directly behind them. No more than a foot behind their heads, he says. This prompted them to get to the car even faster than they were already moving, and neither of them dared to look back. They eventually got out of there and drove around for about an hour, unable to fully comprehend what they saw. About a week later, they were hanging out with another of their friends, who told them the cops had been out there that night searching the woods because of reports of a woman screaming bloody murder. It turned out that they had a helicopter flying in the area and was the same night the OP and his friend encountered what they believed to be the Goatman of Bowie, Maryland. They told their friend what they saw and he was like, "Yeah, you saw the Goatman." One commenter told of his own experiences in that part of Maryland, backing up the story of the Goatman in the area. He tells about how he and his friends would visit a bridge they had dubbed Crybaby Bridge back in the 60s, where they would take people to try and scare them. He says years later he was home from deployment in Vietnam and having drinks with his friends when the topic of the Goatman came up. Every one of them admitted to being really spooked when they visited the bridge, and all of them either heard something or saw something, but everyone had that feeling of being watched by something there. I've always said in these stories that it makes them more credible when there is a second witness there with the OP to see what they are seeing. But to have a complete stranger back them up, especially on the internet, it just adds even more credibility to this one for me. It would seem the Goatman is well known in the area with stories and sightings dating back to the town's establishment, according to the OP. In the comments, the OP and some other users seemed to think that this thing was being territorial due to the fact it got so close to the boys but let them get away. I'm pretty sure being that close to the boys, it could have reached out and grabbed them if it wanted to. This is common in these stories where people get chased. But let's be honest, if these cryptids do grab and kill people, they aren't exactly around to tell their stories. So the only ones we do hear are where the people escape from these encounters. What do you think about this one? Do you think the OP and his friend encountered the Goat Man of Bowie, Maryland? The next story comes from a poster who saw a creature in an orange grove one night. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he worked on an olive farm in Northern California at the time and that it was Native American land. The area where the original poster worked and lived was in a very rural location. He describes where the olive farm was as being a beautiful valley with a lot of organic farms, wild rivers, and tons of wildlife. The OP says he would be at work, and every now and then in the middle of the day or at night the air would be filled with an electricity. He describes it as being like a static hanging right above him. He could feel it, especially on the back of his neck, and says he could even somewhat taste it. Every time this would happen, he was overcome with a sense of dread and became very anxious. This would lead to him ending his day early and heading home. But there was one night when he was out in the orchard finishing his work for the day when the static filled the air. He finished up and was heading home when he saw a monstrous being running through the neighbor's orange grove. He describes it as being a huge, black, bristly creature walking on two legs. He says the static was so intense when he saw this thing that he had a metallic, almost blood-like taste in his mouth. He says in response to a comment that it was almost like he was eating a battery, and that he was overcome with an intense fear in that moment. He wasted no time gunning his car and getting home as fast as he could. I've heard stories where the person having the encounter describes weird smells and tastes during their encounter, but I must say static charge hanging in the air is a new one to me. It is really fascinating how this phenomenon that affects smell and taste happens when these beings are near. There are theories out there ranging from the smell emanating from the creature itself to being an after effect of a portal opening and/or closing. In any case, and I know the OP was probably thinking this after seeing this creature, that it was close by every time he started to feel the static in the air. Perhaps it was farther away though, being that he only tasted what he did when he was close to it. I'm glad he had the good sense to get out of there on the days and nights when this happened and the feeling of dread came over him. It might have saved him from being caught out in a field or orchard with this thing. If I did unfortunately see something like this, I would want it to be from the relative safety of my car as well, so I could do exactly what he did, gun it and get out of there. As for what this thing could have been, he mentions in his telling of the story a dog, a pig, a bear, or even a man. Now I know what you South Park fans are going to say, and someone definitely said it in the comments, that this was Man Bear Pig. I don't think the OP meant it was part dog, part pig, part bear, and part human. I think these are just the things that ran through his head when he got a brief glimpse of this creature. What caught my attention was when he said it looked like a dog or a bear. This could mean it was a dogman or even a Sasquatch. What throws me off a little is him describing it as being bristly. This could be used to describe a dogman's coat, I'm guessing. This is all speculation on my part, however. What do you think he saw that night? The next story comes to us from Manitoba, Canada, from a poster who relays a story told to her by her grandfather about a couple who encountered a humanoid being with the wife, to this day having never been the same. This story also contains the mention of a cryptid I had not heard of before, with one commenter saying what happened to the wife is similar to what he has heard about this obscure cryptid. The original poster says she has never had the platform to share her grandfather's story, but came across a forum where users shared their encounters with humanoid beings, and figured it was the perfect place to tell the tale. The story takes place near the Sandy Bay Aboriginal Reserve in the 1960s. The grandfather was friends with a couple who had a cabin on the reserve and had traveled there for a visit and arrived on a snowy night. They were carrying their luggage to the cabin and saw a very bright light shining inside the cabin. The entire interior of the cabin was illuminated by what the husband describes as a fluorescent icy blue color. He also says he and his wife thought they saw the silhouette of a humanoid figure within the cabin. It was lanky and very tall, standing there by itself before walking out of sight. The couple rushed into the cabin to check things out, searching the entire place, but found nothing. The wife went back out to retrieve more luggage from the car when her husband heard her scream. He ran outside to find her standing in the woods about 25 feet from the car, distraught, yelling and screaming. He ran out to her to find that her eyes were glazed over. This all happened in the span of about 20 to 30 seconds. The most bizarre thing about this scene, however, was that the husband saw her footprints in the snow leading to the car, but there were no footprints or tracks leading out to where she was standing in the woods. If she had walked out into the woods on her own, there would have been tracks leading to the spot. Unfortunately, her condition never relinquished and she was admitted to a mental hospital not long after, and she has been there ever since, with the same glossy-eyed look. She still cannot speak. Whatever she encountered at the cabin horribly traumatized her, and the husband, grandfather, and OP believe it has something to do with the humanoid figure they saw standing in the cabin. The OP's grandfather still talks to the husband and once visited the wife in the hospital, but due to how far away he lives, he was only able to visit on the one occasion. The OP ends her post asking for anyone to leave their theories about what happened to her in the comments. The very first comment came from a user who says he is Cree Manitoban. He says the story reminds him of a cryptid known as the Manigeshi, with stories he has heard about the people involved never being the same after encountering one. The Manigeshi is a cryptid and myth of the Cree natives of Canada. They are described as a race of trickster people. The Dover Demon is said to be one of these creatures and a more modern sighting of the beings. They are said to live between rocks in the rapids, and one of their biggest delights is brawling out of the rocks and capsizing canoes of people canoeing through the rapids, spinning them to their deaths. Now I know this doesn't exactly line up with this story, but the commenter said he gets that vibe, and being that it takes place in Manitoba, who's to say for certain? There is speculation in the comments that the woman was abducted by something or pulled into another dimension, and what she went through lasted a lot longer than the 20 to 30 seconds it took her husband to run outside and find her standing in the woods with no footsteps leading up to her. Their theory is whatever took her brought her back and left her in that spot rather than where she was originally standing. This may seem a little far-fetched to some, but there are theories suggesting that cryptids and what are referred to as aliens, but commonly called greys, are interdimensional beings, and that is why in some stories they are there one second and seemingly vanish without a trace the next. In any case, what happened to the wife in this story is tragic. What do you think happened to her? The next story comes to us from a poster who saw what he describes as a shadow creature late one night. He isn't sure if it belongs among cryptid stories, but posted it alongside them to see if anyone had seen anything similar. He does not say where his story takes place, just that he lived in Appalachia at the time. This is an area of the Appalachian mountain range that begins in southern New York and stretches through a sizable portion of Pennsylvania, parts of Maryland and Ohio, includes all of West Virginia, and covers a lot of ground in Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and some of South Carolina and Georgia before ending in Mississippi. The original poster's encounter, which took place 2 years before he posted it, happened on a fishing trip with his friend. Their friend was moving to Florida and the two decided to take one last trip to go catfishing before he left. Their spot was on a river and the night turned out to be a poor one for fishing as they didn't catch anything. So they started heading for home at around 2 or 3 in the morning, and on their return trip they ran into some fog. The OP says he specifically remembers this because he was smoking a stogie while his friend was half asleep in the passenger seat. The OP looked down briefly to change the song on his phone, and when he returned his eyes to the road, he saw what he says can only be described as a shadow being. It was tall and stood upright on 2 legs and had no discernible color or details. It was just a black void, says the OP, in the shape of an upright silhouette right in front of his headlight. But there was still no detail to this being. It was running across the road in front of him, and the OP says it was moving at such a high speed that it smacked the weeds and tall grass just off the road, resulting in a sound so loud it sent a chill down his spine. His friend was conscious enough to see this thing too, and the OP and him talked about it briefly, just long enough for them both to confirm that they had indeed witnessed it. The OP hasn't seen anything like it since that night. He ends his post by saying he would love some insight on the thing he saw running across the road that night. I know a shadow creature isn't technically a cryptid, but this one shares some similarities to some of the stories I cover on this channel. Also, there are cryptids such as dogmen that are usually described as being blacker than night, so much so that they even stand out in complete darkness. I've heard that over and over in dogman stories I hear, read, and tell on this channel. It could be that the creature was moving so fast that it just looked like a shadow due to how dark it was. Or it very well could have been a shadow creature as described by the OP. This is just speculation on my part. The speed in which it moved reminded me of a cryptid, and it has a physical form due to it running into the tall grass and weeds on the side of the road to produce the spine-chilling sound. Cryptids are commonly described as moving at very high speeds, just like in this story. However, without a more detailed description, it is impossible to say what this thing could have been. All I know is that if I was riding at night in the fog and saw something like this, I would be driving only in the daytime for a long time after that. Luckily, they didn't see this thing again that night, haven't seen it since, and made it out of there without further incident. What do you think about this one? Have any ideas what this creature could have been? The final story of this episode is different from what I normally do on this channel, but I received an email from a viewer detailing their imaginary friend. Or rather, maybe a not so imaginary friend. I'd like to thank Wisteria for sharing their story with me and allowing me to share it on my channel. This isn't your typical cryptid story, but I like to do different things here from time to time, and this story hit kind of close to home for me. I will tell you why after I share it. It reads as follows. When I was a child, my home life wasn't good. It was a violent place without love. That meant I spent most of my time alone. One day when I was around 6, I quote, invented an imaginary friend to deal with my life, or at least I thought that's what I did. One day I noticed this strange creature in my home. It was only about 2 feet tall. It was furry with long claws and big sharp teeth. It had fluffy pointed ears like a cat's ears. There was no tail that I remember. It could have had a bobbed tail or something like that, but nothing that stands out in my memory. Those eyes and teeth are the things I really remember. It was a super dark purple. It had large yellow eyes. At night in the dark or dim light, the creature looked black. It could stand on 2 feet, but mostly ran around on 4 feet. It moved and acted like a cat. It never spoke words, but did growl and grunt. Despite the language barrier, I always knew what he wanted or was trying to say. He stayed with me for many years and never caused any problems. He slept with me and went everywhere with me, but I was the only one who could see him. My family didn't seem that interested in my stories about him. He disappeared when I got older and I didn't think about him again. That was until last year. I got around to watching the TV series Supernatural. For those that don't know, it's a show where a pair of brothers hunt supernatural creatures. There was an episode about imaginary friends. At the mention of imaginary friends, I remembered my little friend and drew a picture of him. I had always labeled him as a hobgoblin, so that's what I said he was. My teenage son thought my description was a bit odd and started researching it. After a while, he came up with the term Talipo. It's a mythological cat-like creature that lives in the Appalachian Mountains. As soon as he showed me drawings and artwork, I knew right away that was the thing that had been my best friend for years. It didn't make sense, but as crazy as it sounded, that seemed to be the only answer. At this point, I know some, if not most of you, are wondering what the heck is a Talipo. Well, it is an urban legend told in and near the Appalachian Mountains. It is about a creature who has its tail removed and comes back looking for it. It is usually described with big bright eyes and sharp teeth. To give you more detail, I will tell you the story, or at least a version of it, as it has many variations. But first, I do want to point out why Wisteria's story hit so close to home for me. When I would visit my great-grandmother growing up, she would often tell me the story of the Talipo. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to include this story in an episode on my channel. However, she would always include a much lighter, sometimes even funny ending to the story so as not to scare me, as the original tale is much, much darker. The story of the Talipo is as follows. Nana, this one is for you. The story begins during a time of near famine with a man and his 3 hounds living out in the middle of nowhere. There is very little game to hunt, which means little food for the man and his dogs. He is out one night hunting for his evening meal and manages to shoot a small rabbit, which he shares with his dogs. But it does little to sate either his or his dog's hunger, so he continues onward looking for another course to his meal. As he presses on, he discovers a bizarre shape with bright eyes and a long tail. He aims and quickly shoots at the creature, severing its tail. Screaming, the creature runs off into the darkness, and being that he is starving, the man eats the tail, usually in a stew. He then returns to his cabin and goes to bed. But when he is about to fall asleep, a rustling and clawing wakes him. He then sits up to see the bright gleaming eyes of the Talipo leering at him from the foot of his bed. In an otherworldly voice, the creature demands the return of its tail, saying, "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." Terrified, the man calls for his hounds, which immediately come and chase the beast into the dark forest. After a while, everything quiets down and the Talipo is perceived to be gone. However, only 2 of the man's dogs return. The man tries to go back to sleep, but the Talipo soon returns, beckoning even more forcefully for the return of its tail. "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." Again, the man sticks his hounds on the Talipo, and again they chase it into the dark forest. However, this time only 1 dog comes back. Unable to sleep, the man clutches his gun and waits for dawn, keeping his last dog close to him. When the Talipo eventually appears for a 3rd time, the man once again orders the hound to attack it. It does so, chasing it off, but does not return. The man, having lost his 3 hounds and now having no protection except his gun, cowers under his blankets and sheets, praying for dawn. Hours before daybreak, the man hears the familiar rustling sound and hopes it's one of his dogs. Unfortunately, it is not. The Talipo leaps onto him, causing him to drop his gun in terror. The beast, now eye to eye with the man, says one more time, "Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo." The man, of course, is unable to oblige. What happens next depends on the variation of the story. The man is either torn to shreds by the creature, or nothing but the chimney is left standing in the aftermath of what happens. In either case, or however else the story ends, the Talipo exacts revenge for the loss of his tail. The story is usually left with the creature roaming the darkness, either calling for the return of its tail or saying, "Talipo, Talipo, now I've got my Talipo." Now, obviously, Wisteria's interaction with the creature that looked almost identical to the Talipo was nowhere near as terrifying as this original story, and it could be said that it was just an imaginary friend. But for it to look so much like this creature is a big coincidence, especially being that Wisteria had never heard this story growing up in the Appalachian Mountains. Ever since I got into cryptid stories, I hear the myths and urban legends surrounding many of them. I often wonder if those legends could be true encounters or stories created based on actual encounters with certain types of cryptids long ago and passed down through generations, being changed and added to along the way. If I had to venture a guess, it would be that these myths and urban legends are just based on actual encounters. For example, I will use Dogman. Many people who have never heard of Dogman think they have seen a werewolf, and many describe it as looking just like one. Now, who is to say Dogman hasn't been around all along and the werewolf legend, myth, or whatever else you want to call it is based on the cryptid, albeit with the exaggeration of a human transforming into the beast. That could have been added somewhere along the way. That's just my personal theory anyway, so take it for what it's worth. I also want to mention, in searching for a version of this story to tell, I did see where people claim to have encountered the Talipo. So who knows? Maybe I'll have a full episode dedicated to the creature in the future. What do you think about Wisteria's imaginary friend? Do you believe it to be just a coincidence that it looked almost identical to the Talipo, or could there be more to the story? Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share disturbing black-eyed children stories I found on the internet. These stories include two boys who saw something bizarre in the park one night, a woman who had to rush back inside work to avoid two of these beings, a young woman who saw something terrifying on a security camera monitor, and a car ride that takes a creepy and terrifying turn. But first, we start with a young man who had a chilling encounter outside of work one night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had an ominous experience while at work one night that left him with a feeling of dread when thinking about returning there. The original poster, or OP, does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he worked at a 7-Eleven overnight. It was about 2:45 in the morning when the OP was doing his shift change, and as he was finishing up, he heard the store's front door chime. This drew his gaze, but he saw nothing but the open door sliding shut. However, beyond the door, past the pumps, he saw a boy and a girl. He says both children were dressed in normal clothes, with the boy wearing a black t-shirt and the girl wearing a dress with a white top and a black skirt. This confused him as it was now 2:50 a.m. He finished counting the money, and when he looked back out, the children hadn't moved. This is when he started feeling like something was off, and a wave of anxiety rushed over him. Even the hair on his arms was standing on end. He walked out front and asked what the children were doing out there alone, but got no response. This, for some reason, sent a surge of fear through him. This was when the girl, who the OP says was about a year or two older than the boy by the looks of it, jumped off the curb before extending her hand to the boy, who jumped playfully off the curb where they were standing. The OP told the children to come inside where it was warm, but as he said this, his body felt like it shut down and he was overcome with a fear like he had never felt. He had to pull himself through the door using the handle, and as soon as he was back inside, the fear completely dissipated. He ran behind the counter and watched this boy and girl approach the store, but lost sight of them and didn't see them again. He was scheduled to work the night that he posted his story and was terrified about the fact he had invited them in, wondering if he was in trouble. He also noticed that his cat had been hissing at nothing while he was home alone. He believes they stopped their approach toward the store because of the lighting in front and how bright it was. He had his boss roll back the camera footage from the night, but he saw nothing on it, making everyone think he was crazy. He knew posting his story alongside other black-eyed children stories would help because those who have experienced this for themselves would believe him. He ends his post by saying he is worried about going back to work, and the feeling of heading toward his impending doom fills his chest when he does. Even though the OP didn't mention anything about the children's eyes, pretty much everything in this story lines up with what happens in other black-eyed children's stories. Their sudden appearance, standing there not saying a word, the way they are dressed, children being out at that time of night or morning, the fear and anxiety that came over the OP, and their sudden disappearance. When you encounter these beings, you are absolutely not supposed to let them in or invite them into your home. The fact that he told them to come inside the store might have something to do with the fact that he feels an impending doom and dread when he thinks about going back there. The fact that his cat hisses at something that isn't there while he is home alone is concerning too. But usually when people invite these children in, they begin to feel ill and there is a pall that hangs over their home. However, the OP has posted many times since he posted this story and hasn't mentioned black-eyed children again or anything else happening. So hopefully nothing came of his encounter. I know that had to have been terrifying, looking up and seeing those children in the dead of the night and then to experience what he did. He seems to be doing okay though. What do you think about this one? And what would you have done if you looked outside and saw two children standing there in the middle of the night? The next story comes from a poster who had a bizarre experience at a park late one night. The original poster says he has seen a lot of people say black-eyed children aren't real, and he isn't here to convince anyone if they are or not, but he does insist that what happened to him and his friend is a true story. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he was a junior or senior in high school when his encounter happened. The OP and his friend, who he calls T, had snuck out one night to get stoned. They partook quite regularly and were quite accustomed to sneaking out and walking around the town while smoking. He gives some background information on his town, not knowing if it has any significance or ties to what happened, but says it is an old mining town with some bad history. As they walked at around midnight, they left behind all the active districts in the town and were walking down a road heading to the park, which was their destination. The park was located in a somewhat decent neighborhood according to the OP. As they walked, they laughed and cut up like normal teens, stopping under the one and only streetlight in the area. The light lit up only about 10 feet in each direction. It was then that T stopped, staring straight ahead into the darkness and asked the OP, "Do you see that?" The OP says he saw nothing there and hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. T hurried to find and pull out his phone, turning on the flashlight to illuminate something the OP says he will never forget. Directly in front of them on a playset were 3 children. They sat unmoving even when the light hit them, but the OP couldn't see their eyes. His friend told the children they scared them, but there came no reply. The 3 of them just sat there staring at the OP and T. The OP started backing up and told the children bye before he and his friend left. He notes that they heard nothing behind them as they departed, not the children leaving or nothing. There was only dead silence. Upon returning to T's house, it dawned on the OP that it was 1 o'clock in the morning and the children they saw in the park were no older than elementary school age. He ends his post saying he will never forget that night. I honestly don't know what I would do if I turned on a light in the park in the middle of the night and saw 3 children just sitting there in the complete darkness staring at me. I don't blame the OP for immediately getting out of there. Just like in the first story, there is no clear description of the children's eyes in this one. However, with the OP and his friend being out in the middle of the night with nothing but his cell phone's light, there is a good chance he couldn't really make out their eyes. Also, just like in the first story, the appearance and mannerisms of the children in this story match those of other black-eyed children's stories. Out in the middle of the night, and the way they just sat there staring. Then there is them not responding when the OP's friend says something to them. Luckily, when they left, nothing happened and they weren't followed. I don't know that I'd be going back to that park, especially in the middle of the night. What do you think about this story? Does it make you want to go to the park at night? The next story comes to us from a poster who had what she believes to be two black-eyed children try to force their way into where she works. She does not say where her story takes place, just that she worked in an office that mainly handled business-to-business sales and rentals. The office's location was in a bad part of town, and they weren't open to the public, so they kept the front door locked. The only way to open the door was with a key from either side. On the day of her encounter, the OP was about to leave her office on a sales call. The front door was tinted so whoever was on the inside could see out, but whoever was looking in could only see their own reflection. The OP always observes her surroundings before walking outside due to her job's location. When looking, she saw two young men walking down the street about a block away. This was no big deal, as she would be able to reach her car before they reached her if they had any ill intent. So she ventured out, but the two boys, who looked to be about 15 years old, were suddenly much closer than they had been when she was looking out the door. The OP says here that it was like they covered a whole city block in a split second. This is when her fight or flight kicked in and she went back inside and locked the door. She says she was overcome by an intense fear even though she had no reason to be afraid. She mentions that she isn't even sure how to describe the fear she felt that day. Once she was back inside, the boys approached the door and started banging on it. One of the boys said, "We need a phone, let us in," as they continued to bang so hard that the glass door was vibrating. The OP shouted back no, but they continued to try to get inside. She threatened to call the police, but this did not deter the two boys, who continued to bang on the door while begging to use the phone. The OP then says she gathered the courage to get a closer look at these boys so she could describe them to the police, and this is when she noticed that their eyes were completely black. Even though she is not a religious person, she yelled, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." As soon as the words left her lips, the boys disappeared. The OP says it was like they just vanished. She ends her post by saying she had never heard of black-eyed children before her encounter. This story presents the black-eyed children acting much more aggressively than I've heard in other stories. Granted, I'm still pretty new to this phenomenon, but other stories, they are insistent and pushy about being let inside, but this is the first one I've heard where they actively try to beat down the door. But what they said lines up with what they say in other stories too, with them saying they need to use the phone. This is just one example of the reasons why they need to come into your home or place of work. This is not the first story where I have heard of people invoking the name of Jesus to repel cryptids, creatures, spirits, demons, or the like. This is exactly what I did during my own experience with a demon, and I haven't had any trouble since. These entities fear his name, and with good reason. They are evil with malicious intent. Now, I know a case could be made for some cryptids, as there are stories out there with them actually helping people out. But for the most part, everything I listed is malicious. It only makes sense that they would fear the name of Jesus. This is also not the first story I've heard where someone who isn't religious calls upon his name and is saved from whatever is tormenting them. In any case, I'm glad she was able to do so, as this must have been terrifying, especially with how aggressive these black-eyed children were acting. What do you think about this one? Have you ever called upon the name of Jesus to repel an evil being, or heard a story where someone has? The next story comes from a poster who saw something terrifying outside her friend's house one night. The original poster does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she was staying at a friend's house after a night out and she had a bit too many drinks to be able to drive home. She notes that her friend has cameras all around his home. She says this happened a while before she posted it, but she remembers it like it happened yesterday. It was about 3 or 4 in the morning, and all of the OP's other friends were asleep. She was awake, lying on the couch as her drunken state was wearing off. She was close to falling asleep when she began hearing a light tapping on the door. She stirred from the couch to see what it could be when she heard the tapping again. She made her way to the front door and looked through the peephole to see 2 small children standing there dressed in raggedy clothes. Convinced she was seeing things, she went to her friend's security monitor that showed the view from the front door's camera and could still see the children. She started to go open the door when one of the children looked up at the camera as if they could see her. This is when the OP says her blood ran cold as she saw this child's eyes. They were completely black. No white at all, even where it should have been. He then said, "Can I come in?" The OP convinced herself she hadn't been seen by that child looking at the camera and returned to the couch, lying there listening to the faint tapping until she fell asleep. The next day, her friend woke her up and the OP told him and her other friends what happened. They were all convinced she was just seeing things, as her friend lived in a rural area with the closest neighborhood being about a mile away, and there was no reason for children to be out that late. The OP agreed but insisted she saw something and told them to check the cameras. Her friend who lived there did as she asked, but the camera facing the front door shut off right around the time in question. However, another camera clearly saw the OP looking at the monitor in bewilderment. She ends her post saying she isn't usually one to believe in these kinds of things, but she knows what she saw and she has no logical explanation for it. I'm pretty sure the last thing I would want to hear at my door at that time of night would be a light tapping. Then to look through the peephole to see 2 children standing there in raggedy clothes. Now, my first thought before hearing about black-eyed children would be to open the door and try to help them. But imagine looking at the monitor to ensure yourself you are in fact seeing what you're actually seeing and having a child with black eyes look seemingly directly at you. Then ask if they can come in. I honestly don't think I'd look through my peephole ever again. I don't blame the OP for leaving the door and going back to the couch. Honestly, it was the best thing she could have done. Even if she had opened the door, as long as she didn't give these beings permission to enter the home, she would have been fine. But ignoring them seems to be the best course of action. What would you have done if you looked through your peephole to see 2 children standing there that late at night? Then to have one look at the camera and seem to be looking directly at you. The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw something very strange and terrifying one morning when her mother gave her a ride to school. She does not say where her story takes place, just that she lived in a very small neighborhood she describes as more of a glorified cul-de-sac, with one more like it in the proximity, and homes here and there with nothing in between but long rural stretches. The OP's encounter took place when she was either a freshman or sophomore in high school. She had missed the bus, and being that she didn't yet have a car, her mother gave her a ride to school. She mentions it was still dark out and a very cold morning. Just as she and her mother were pulling out of their neighborhood, they both see 3 children standing on the sidewalk, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, with all 3 of them wearing blue and white private school uniforms. She believes there were 2 girls and a boy, but says she cannot remember exactly, and it could have been 2 boys and a girl. In any case, she says the girls were wearing blue and white dresses while the boy had on a short-sleeved blue shirt and khaki shorts. She points out here how weird their attire was, being that it was about 40 degrees outside and they weren't wearing coats or anything else to keep them warm. She also noticed that there were only 2 schools in the area, but neither was a private school. In fact, the closest private school was in the next town over, and the school's colors did not match those the children were wearing. The thing she found the weirdest about the children, though, was that they were standing side by side completely still. This was absolutely unlikely at the age these children appeared to be. What made the scene even creepier was that there was no street light or light of any kind where the children were standing. They were just standing there, completely still, shoulder to shoulder, in the dark. They stood on the side of the street closest to the passenger side where the OP was sitting, and of course she and her mother had to turn right, putting her that much closer to them. The OP says she at first couldn't see their faces due to it being dark and the shadows created by the car's headlights, which only lit them up from the neck down, and why she remembers their outfits so vividly. But when the headlights eventually did light up their faces, she was horrified to see that their eyes were completely black. They had no white in them whatsoever. Her mother noticed this before she did and gunned it, speeding away from the children as quickly as possible. The OP tried to turn back to see if the children were still there, but it was too dark. Her mother did not return home until the sun had come up and everything was bright enough that she wasn't scared. The OP shared her story at school, but no one believed her, and when she and her mother told her siblings what happened, they thought they were messing with them. However, she says they both know what they saw, but they never saw the children again. At the time, the OP believed she and her mother had seen 3 ghosts standing on the side of the road, but she later learned about black-eyed children on YouTube and made the connection. Not long after her encounter, her family moved away and she had forgotten about the whole incident until her mother brought it up one night. This not only reminded her of her terrifying event, but has once again instilled within her the fear she felt that morning. This might be one of the most bizarre black-eyed children stories I've heard, with them standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, without moving. It is something straight out of a horror movie. Well, to be honest, almost every encounter with these beings is like that. And to see them standing there wearing school uniforms that don't match any close by. I would have thought I was looking at ghosts too. The OP mentions how scared she was in the comments, having to relive that, and I don't blame her. However, I wouldn't worry about getting another visit from these children, being that she and her mother didn't interact with them and drove away immediately. That and the fact that they never saw them again. Still though, it isn't something I'd like to think about or remember either. It must have been terrifying to go from seeing a confusing, creepy sight like 3 children standing there in the dark to seeing that their eyes were completely black. The mother absolutely did the right thing. Another thing that adds credibility to this one for me is that the mother not only saw them too, but brought up the encounter years later. Sometimes in these stories, people either block it out or just weirdly forget. I've heard stories where 2 people see something, then one completely forgets about it later on. And it isn't a situation where they just refuse to talk about it either, because I've come across those too. But this is something different, where they either block it out or don't remember for some reason. It's a good thing the OP has her mother to talk to about this if she ever needs someone to listen to, especially with no one else believing them. What would you do if you were driving in the dark and saw children standing creepily on the sidewalk, not moving? Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 skinwalker encounters, with all 4 coming from Navajo people. The skinwalker is a part of the Navajo folklore, and it is amazing how they can immediately spot one and or know how to deal with one during an encounter. These 4 stories demonstrate just that, and it's a good thing they do know how to deal with one, because these encounters could have gone terribly wrong if they didn't. Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode takes place near Window Rock, Arizona. Window Rock is located in Apache County in northeastern Arizona, just over the New Mexico state line. It serves as the seat of government and capital of the Navajo Nation, and has a population of approximately 2,500 people according to the 2020 census. Its main attraction is the natural window formation of sandstone carved out by wind erosion. Window Rock is also home to the Navajo Nation Museum, the Navajo Nation Zoological and Botanical Park, and the Navajo Nation Code Talkers World War II Memorial. The original poster, or OP, was on a delivery with his father, who owns and operates a delivery service out of Farmington, New Mexico. It's a small business that delivers smaller packages to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for a larger delivery company, according to the OP. He was 6 or 7 at the time of the events. His father had gotten a call for the delivery to the reservation at Window Rock, which is about 2 hours from Farmington. He was with his friend and his friend's girlfriend at the time. His father's friend, who is Navajo, has family in Window Rock he hasn't seen in a long time, so the OP's father suggested they all head out there together. He will bring his son, the OP, and while the friend and his girlfriend go see family, he will take his son to Window Rock. They were forced to take separate trucks due to the size of the freight his father was hauling, so the friend and his girlfriend followed the OP and his father. They used walkie-talkies to communicate during the trip. The delivery and his visit to Window Rock were uneventful, but what the OP says he will remember for the rest of his life was what happened on the way home. While they were riding down the old highway, somewhere between Window Rock and Gallup, New Mexico, they were riding past sandstone cliffs on the left and a huge field to the right, separated from the road by a barbed wire fence. They were taking it a bit slower because it had rained earlier in the day, leaving the road slick. They drove over a hill, and at the bottom they saw what looked like a very big dog sitting in the middle of the road. The OP's father radioed to his friend who was following behind them and asked if he saw the huge dog. His friend immediately started yelling back over the radio, "That is not a dog. Speed up right now and hit it." The OP describes him as sounding hysterical. He continued to scream, "Hit it. You have to hit it. Please. Please hit that effing thing right now." After hearing his friend plead with him, the OP's father sped his truck up. When they got closer, they got a better look at the thing in the road. It was covered in brown fur that was wiry and matted down and looked as if it had dried blood all over it. It was facing the cliffs, but when the headlights hit it, the beast turned its head and looked at the truck bearing down on it. The OP describes the face as looking like the mixture of a bear and a man. It had a twisted, distorted look on its face as if it was in pain. Being this close, the OP and his father realized how massive this thing really is. It was on its haunches, but its shoulders were just about even with the hood of the truck. Just as they were about to hit it, the creature lets out a gargled scream before leaping toward the field and landing on the other side of the barbed wire fence. It leaps again and disappears from sight. His father's friend came back on the radio and told them they need to keep driving and they needed to get out of there. He kept urging the OP's father to drive faster, repeating it over and over. By the time they reached the outskirts of Gallup, New Mexico, they were flying down the highway. They got pulled over, so his father's friend pulled over too. The cop, who was also Navajo, as trained, is wary of this and asked his friend why he also pulled over. He tells the officer that they just saw a skinwalker and has been following them. The officer is visibly shaken up by this, mutters something about a warning, hurries back to his car and takes off. The OP's father and friend did the same. Nothing else happened that night, but his father's friend would not let them leave his home when they returned without taking a Navajo totem meant to keep skinwalkers away. This is the region of the US where the majority of the skinwalker encounters are documented, and it seems that no one out there, especially the Navajo, are messing around when it comes to these things. The friend immediately told the OP's father to hit the perceived dog, and the officer wasted no time getting out of there when he found out what they were running from. From what I've read and heard, most Navajo won't even acknowledge or talk about skinwalkers for fear of attracting them. The next story comes from a poster who doesn't say where the incident took place, but that he and his uncle, who he was with at the time, are both Navajo. He was younger when the encounter took place and was on his way home from chopping and gathering firewood for his grandmother with his uncle. Dusk had settled over the woods as they drove down the old dirt road at about 30 miles an hour. The entire ride, the original poster had the terrible feeling that he was being watched. He began to turn and look out the passenger side window when his uncle shouted, "Don't!" He didn't look, but froze, his heart pounding in his chest when the tapping came at his window. His uncle sped up and began to pray in their native language. The OP wasn't quite sure what was going on, but at one point he thought they were safe before the back of the truck dipped down as if something heavy had landed in the bed. His uncle kept saying, "Look at me, don't turn away," over and over. Then the OP heard tapping at the window again, this time from behind him. He started having trouble breathing and felt like he was going to cry. A long few minutes passed and the truck jerked again, this time as if something heavy jumped out of the bed. His uncle inspected their surroundings then and sighed. The worst of it was over. They sat in silence for a moment before his uncle looked at him and said he would ask his father to do a prayer for them in the morning so the evil will forget their faces. He said this in Navajo. All the OP could do was curl up in his seat and stare at the radio for the rest of the ride home, listening to his uncle sing an old prayer. The OP later called his uncle after having a nightmare about that night. His uncle was happy to talk to him until he settled down. He told the OP he didn't see any faces, just eyes. They were like brake lights you see on the road at night. They were watching the OP. He was again speaking in Navajo when he told his nephew this. Before the call ended, the OP made a joke about him not slamming on brakes when the thing was in the back of the truck. His uncle did not laugh. He sat in silence for a few seconds before answering, because it wasn't alone. It's a good thing his uncle stayed calm in that situation. Well, about as calm as he could, probably. To be able to keep the truck on the road while all that was going on took a tremendous amount of composure. I wonder what made the skinwalkers just up and leave them alone. Perhaps it was them not showing them any attention. In any case, they got very lucky. The next story comes from a poster whose aunt had a terrifying encounter with a skinwalker while partying in a van with her friends. The original poster doesn't say if he is full-blooded Navajo, but his mother is, and her hometown is on the Navajo reservation. He does not say where exactly this story takes place, just that his aunt was on the reservation during the encounter. He would take road trips with his family to his mother's hometown. During the trips to the reservation, he would ask his mother to tell him about the skinwalkers. He never had any encounters himself, but remembered every story his mother told him, especially the one about how his aunt had a horrifying experience one night while partying with her friends. When she was younger, his aunt was quite the partier. Not having anywhere to go and do so on the reservation, she and her friends would pile into the back of an old van, drive to the middle of nowhere, and drink and have fun. They had gone about their normal routine on the night of their encounter, parking the van and going about their partying when they heard what sounded like rocks being thrown at the van. They stopped and quieted down, listening and wondering what could be doing that, when the rocks finally stopped hitting the van. Moments later, something big landed on the roof. Everyone panicked and hurried to lock the doors. His aunt jumped in the front seat and tried to start the van, but the old van's engine wouldn't turn over. The thing on the roof was either banging on top of the van or jumping up and down, freaking everyone out as chaos ensued. The van still wouldn't start. That's when his aunt saw a hand reach down from the roof with very long nails and scratch the windshield before whatever it was jumped off. His aunt's friends were still freaking out, yelling at her to go. All the while, she was still trying to start the van. Then, something walked up to the driver's side window and stared at her, inches away, nothing separating them but the glass. She quickly jumped into the back seat and started praying for her life. A few painstaking minutes passed and the skinwalker finally seemed to leave. The OP's aunt jumped back in the front seat and the van blessedly started up and she got them out of there. That would have to be the worst feeling in the world, to not be able to start your car when something like that is happening. I couldn't imagine the panic that must have set in not only for the person trying to start the car, but everyone else too. I wish we had gotten a more detailed description of the skinwalker when it came up to the window, if she even looked at it, that is. I don't know that I would have been able to. It seemed to want to terrorize them, which it definitely succeeded at, more so than anything else. I'm not sure why it didn't try to get into the van and what caused it to flee, but it seemed to have done so when the OP's aunt started praying. What do you think? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who is Navajo, but grew up away from the Navajo Nation and has always been skeptical about skinwalkers, even though his mother told him a story of how she saw one when she lived with his grandparents back in the 80s. She described seeing a big black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and unnatural burnt orange eyes that glowed softly, standing under the streetlight at the end of their driveway. The original poster doubted his mother's story, but never voiced his opinion. Well, his doubts would soon be put to rest when he visited his grandparents, who lived in Shiprock, New Mexico. Shiprock is located in San Juan County, which makes up the upper northwest corner of the state. The county borders Colorado to the north, Arizona to its west, and its northwestern tip meets the southwestern tip of Utah. Shiprock is located in the northwestern part of the county, and as of the 2020 census has a population of 7,718 people. It is aptly named after the nearby Shiprock rock formation. The OP and his family had gone to the Navajo Nation Fair and walked to his grandparents' home at approximately 9 p.m., where they sat up until about 2 a.m. catching up. During this time, he blurted out the question, "Are skinwalkers real?" His grandmother, disturbed by the question, semi-yelled at him that he should not speak about such things. Shortly thereafter, his grandparents went to bed, and after his mother scolded him for asking that question, his aunt told him that they are real all right, then told him about the screaming outside her home in Farmington, New Mexico, just a few nights prior. He let the subject drop, and everyone went to bed. Not long after, the OP was the only one awake, lying in his bed thinking about skinwalkers, and if he would encounter one while on the reservation. According to him, it is taboo just thinking about them, as that can supposedly attract them, just as speaking about them also can. It was a nice night, so they were sleeping with the windows open. Each window had a screen to keep the bugs from getting in. He was about to doze off when he began hearing movement outside the trailer. He got up and slowly made his way to the kitchen window. All the inside lights were off, and the only light came from the front porch light. This gave him a sense of security, as hopefully if anything was outside, it wouldn't be able to see him peeking out. He hesitated, but his curiosity got the best of him, and he looked out the window. All he could see was the dirt on the ground lit by the front porch light, the cars, and 2 metal trash cans standing by the road. He dismissed the sound as a stray cat or something and turned to go back to bed when a loud, distorted scream broke the silence. The scream was very close. Fear washed over him as he turned and looked back out the window to see a figure resembling a coyote staring at the window from behind the cars. It stood just out of the light's reach. He described it as looking wrong and giving off an evil vibe. It had gray fur that was disheveled and soft glowing red-orange eyes. He ran back to the bedroom as a putrid stench that smelled like rotting meat hit his nose. He immediately woke up his mother, who was annoyed due to the late hour and was trying to tell her something was outside. She told him it was probably just a stray animal, as there were a lot of stray animals on the reservation. Finally, the OP screamed at her that there was some Blair Witch stuff happening outside, and this got her attention. That's about the time the noises started back up outside. Another dreadful scream filled the night, and it sounded like something was thrashing around. His mother got up and they both went over to the window, where they saw the unnatural coyote-like creature walking toward the front door with a limp while dragging its back leg. It started scratching on the door while making a weird, muffled moaning sound. His mother went and woke up his father, and they began yelling in Navajo at the creature, saying it was not welcome there and to go away. It didn't take long for everyone in the trailer to wake up and come down the hall. The OP's mother turned to look at them and could only say "Skinwalker" while pointing at the front door. Meanwhile, the noises continued outside. Luckily, his grandfather knew exactly what to do. He retrieved his handgun and a bag of ashes. He used the ashes to coat a few bullets before loading them into the gun. With the now loaded firearm, he went straight to the front door while yelling in Navajo. The OP says that whatever his grandfather was saying was way too fast for him to understand. When he reached the front door, he flung it open and fired at the creature twice. Unfortunately, though, the beast managed to escape before his grandfather could get it. His grandfather said, "That's the fastest one I've ever seen," before he came back inside. The OP, his parents, and his aunt were freaking out, worried that they were now targeted because it saw them and that it might come back the next night. His grandparents eventually calmed everyone down and they went to bed. The next morning, his grandparents called one of their neighbors and told them what happened. Apparently, he was a medicine man who used to conduct Navajo healing ceremonies to cure sickness. He came over and blessed each family member before blessing the grounds outside. I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying that experience must have been. Luckily, his grandfather knew exactly what to do. This isn't the first story I've heard where ash-coated bullets are used to fend off skinwalkers. The Navajo may not talk about skinwalkers, but they sure do know how to deal with one when facing them. I guess you would have to know if you lived on the reservation. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.